The rain started before sunrise and stayed steady as the city slowly woke up. Cars moved through wet streets while lights reflected off the pavement. People hurried with their heads down and their coats pulled tight. Near the courthouse steps stood a black woman named Grace. She held a plain leather bag and waited quietly under a narrow awning. Grace arrived early because she liked silence before the day began. She used that time to prepare her thoughts and steady her breathing. The courthouse doors were still locked and no one else was waiting nearby. Rain tapped softly against the stone walls and metal railings. Grace watched the street and stayed still. She wore a simple coat and low shoes that showed signs of long use. Nothing about her clothes suggested power or status. To most people she looked like someone easy to ignore. Grace had learned long ago that appearance shaped how others behaved. She did not let that knowledge harden her face. A police car rolled slowly down the street and then stopped. Two officers stepped out and glanced around with tired eyes. One officer was tall and broad while the other was shorter and lean. They looked bored and alert at the same time. The tall officer noticed Grace and frowned. He walked closer and spoke with a firm voice. He told her she could not stand there. Grace turned toward him without surprise. She explained that she was waiting for the building to open. Her tone was calm and measured. The shorter officer laughed under his breath. He asked what was inside her bag. Grace answered that it held documents. She did not raise her voice or shift her posture. The rain continued to fall between them. The tall officer crossed his arms and said the area was restricted. He claimed they had received complaints. Grace looked around at the empty sidewalk. She asked calmly what the complaints were about. Her question was met with silence. The shorter officer told her to leave. He said people always made excuses. Grace said she had business inside the courthouse. She remained standing where she was. Her hands rested naturally at her sides. The tall officer stepped closer and lowered his voice. He said she did not look like she belonged there. Those words landed heavily even though they were spoken casually. Grace felt a familiar tight feeling in her chest. She had felt it many times in her life. Grace had learned patience from long years of work. She had learned restraint from moments that tested her resolve. She had learned silence when speaking would change nothing. She did not let her emotions show on her face. She simply met the officer's eyes. She told him she belonged wherever the law allowed her to stand. Her voice did not shake. The shorter officer smirked and made a comment about lawyers. He did not realize how close he was to the truth. Grace did not respond to his remark. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the awning. The sound filled the space between them. A few cars passed but no one stopped. The officers waited as if expecting her to give in. Grace remained still. Grace reached slowly into her bag. She moved carefully so her actions were clear. Both officers stiffened as they watched her hands. She said she could show identification. Her words were calm and steady. The tall officer waved his hand and told her to stop. He said they would decide what happened next. Grace paused and withdrew her hand. She closed the bag again. She kept her eyes forward. Inside the courthouse the lights suddenly turned on. The soft glow spread through the tall windows. A security guard unlocked the front doors. He looked out and saw Grace standing there. His face changed immediately. The guard stepped outside and greeted her respectfully. He addressed her with a formal title. His voice carried clearly through the rain. Both officers froze in place. The street felt suddenly quiet. Grace straightened her posture. She did not smile or frown. She acknowledged the guard with a nod. The officers looked at each other in confusion. They did not speak. The guard stepped aside and opened the door wider. He waited for Grace to enter. The officers finally realized something was wrong. The tall officer cleared his throat. He looked unsure for the first time. Grace did not rush. She walked forward with calm purpose. Her shoes echoed softly against the stone steps. She passed between the two officers without a word. The rain continued to fall behind her. As Grace crossed the threshold, she felt no triumph. She felt only focus and responsibility. This was not the first moment of its kind. It would not be the last. Inside the courthouse, a long day was waiting. The hallway inside the courthouse smelled of polished floors and old paper. Grace walked forward with steady steps and did not look back. Her bag rested against her side as it always did. The guard closed the doors behind her and returned to his post. The sound of rain faded into silence. Grace moved through the security area with calm familiarity. The officers at the desk greeted her politely. They knew her face even if others did not. She nodded and continued without stopping. Her mind was already focused on the day ahead. Behind the glass doors, the two officers remained outside. They stood frozen for a moment as confusion settled in. The shorter officer broke the silence first. He asked the guard who she was. The guard answered with a quiet seriousness. He explained that Grace was a federal judge. The words landed hard and without mercy. The tall officer felt heat rise to his face. The shorter officer swallowed and looked down. Neither spoke again. Inside the building, Grace entered a small elevator. The doors closed with a soft sound. She exhaled slowly as the elevator rose. Moments like these weighed on her more than trials ever did. She did not enjoy being underestimated. Grace remembered the long road that brought her here. She remembered late nights and early mornings. She remembered doubt from others and doubt within herself. She remembered choosing discipline over anger again and again. Those memories shaped her strength. The elevator opened on a quiet floor. Grace stepped out and walked down a narrow corridor. Her chambers waited at the end of the hall. A clerk named Anna stood near the door. Anna smiled warmly when she saw Grace. Anna apologized for the delay in the morning schedule. Grace waved it off gently. She said the day would unfold as it needed to. They exchanged brief updates about hearings and filings. Work always brought comfort to Grace. Grace entered her office and set her bag down. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. The room was simple and orderly. Law books lined the shelves with quiet authority. This space felt earned. She sat at her desk and reviewed the case files. Each page held lives and consequences. Grace took that responsibility seriously. She believed fairness demanded attention and patience. Every decision mattered. As the morning passed, the courthouse filled with people. Attorneys paced hallways while families waited anxiously. Grace prepared herself for the first hearing. She straightened her robe and took a breath. Then she stepped into the courtroom. The room stood as she entered. Silence followed out of respect, not fear. Grace took her seat with composed grace. Her expression revealed neither warmth nor coldness. Only focus filled her eyes. The first case began and voices filled the room. Grace listened carefully to every word. She asked questions that cut through confusion. Her tone remained even and thoughtful. The courtroom moved at her pace. Outside in the city, the rain finally stopped. Clouds broke apart and light touched the streets. The two officers still stood near their patrol car. They spoke quietly among themselves. Regret settled heavily between them. The tall officer replayed the encounter in his mind. He thought about his words and his assumptions. The shorter officer stared at the courthouse doors. Neither felt proud. Neither knew what to say. They returned to their car without another word. The engine started and the car pulled away. The street looked the same as before. But something inside them had shifted. The moment would stay with them. Inside the courtroom, Grace reached a decision. Her ruling was firm and balanced. The room listened closely as she spoke. She explained her reasoning clearly. Justice required clarity. As the hearing ended, people filed out quietly. Some faces showed relief while others showed disappointment. Grace accepted both reactions with equal calm. She believed the process mattered more than praise. That belief guided her work. During a brief recess, Grace returned to her chambers. She stood by the window and looked outside. The wet pavement now reflected sunlight. The city moved on, as it always did. Grace felt the weight of her role settle again. She did not think about the officers with anger. She thought about the pattern behind the moment. She thought about how often respect came too late. That thought stayed with her quietly. It fueled her resolve. Grace turned back to her desk and prepared for the next case. The day was far from over. More voices waited to be heard. More lives waited for decisions. Grace was ready to listen. The afternoon settled into a steady rhythm inside the courthouse. Grace moved from one hearing to the next with calm precision. Each case brought different voices and different emotions. She listened without judgment and spoke with care. Her presence filled the room with quiet authority. In one case, a young man stood nervously before the bench. His hands trembled as he spoke about his mistake. Grace watched his face and heard more than his words. She understood fear and pressure all too well. Her questions were firm but fair. She explained the law in simple terms. She made sure he understood the weight of his choices. Her ruling balanced accountability with opportunity. The room felt lighter when the case ended. Grace believed justice could guide rather than crush. Between hearings, Grace returned to her chambers briefly. She reviewed notes and signed documents. Her clerk Anna worked quietly beside her. They shared a brief look of understanding. Long days like this were common. Grace thought about the morning encounter again. Not with anger but with clarity. She knew moments like that reflected deeper habits. She had faced them since early in her career. They shaped her resolve rather than weakening it. Years earlier, Grace had walked into courtrooms as a young attorney. She remembered being mistaken for support staff. She remembered questions that doubted her role. Each time she chose preparation over reaction. That choice carried her forward. The courthouse clock marked the passing hours. People continued to move through hallways. Some whispered while others argued softly. Security officers changed shifts. The building carried many stories at once. Outside, the tall officer sat in his patrol car. He stared through the windshield without focus. The moment replayed in his mind again and again. He questioned how quickly he had judged. The thought unsettled him deeply. The shorter officer broke the silence. He admitted the encounter had shaken him. He spoke about assumptions learned without challenge. The tall officer listened quietly. Neither tried to excuse their behavior. They talked longer than usual that afternoon. Not about routine calls or schedules. They talked about awareness and responsibility. The conversation felt uncomfortable but necessary. Change often began that way. Back inside, Grace entered another courtroom. This case involved a dispute between neighbors. Voices rose as emotions spilled out. Grace raised her hand gently. Silence returned immediately. She guided the conversation step by step. She reminded them of respect and order. Her calm presence slowed the tension. The case unfolded with clarity. Resolution came through reason rather than conflict. As the afternoon continued, Grace felt the familiar fatigue. It settled into her shoulders and back. She welcomed it as proof of meaningful work. Rest would come later. For now, focus remained. During a short break, Grace walked down a quiet corridor. She paused near a window overlooking the city. Sunlight touched the tops of nearby buildings. Life outside moved freely and unaware. Grace felt grounded in that contrast. She thought about the people who came before her. Those who opened doors without seeing the results. She honored them through her work. Progress often came in quiet moments. Not every change made headlines. Anna approached with updated files. Grace thanked her and smiled softly. They shared a brief moment of calm. Support mattered in demanding roles. Grace never took it for granted. Another hearing began late in the afternoon. This case involved a long-standing contract dispute. Arguments were detailed and technical. Grace followed every point carefully. Her questions revealed deep understanding. The attorneys adjusted their arguments accordingly. The courtroom stayed attentive. Grace guided the discussion toward clarity. She valued truth over theatrics. That standard shaped her reputation. Outside the courthouse, the officers finished their shift. They walked toward the exit quietly. The building felt different to them now. Not because it had changed, but because they had. The tall officer paused near the steps. He looked at the entrance where Grace had stood earlier. He felt a mix of regret and respect. The moment stayed with him. It would influence his actions moving forward. As evening approached, Grace concluded the final hearing. Her voice remained steady despite the long day. She issued her ruling with confidence. The courtroom acknowledged her decision. Order returned once more. Grace returned to her chambers one last time. She removed her robe and sat quietly. The day replayed briefly in her thoughts. She felt no need to dwell on it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. She gathered her bag and prepared to leave. The hallway outside was quieter now. Most people had gone home. The courthouse rested for the night. Grace walked out with calm purpose. As she stepped outside, the air felt cool and fresh. The rain had long stopped. The city lights began to glow. Grace paused for a moment. She took a deep breath and continued forward. Grace walked toward the parking garage with her bag on her shoulder and her keys in her hand. The courthouse behind her looked calm now, with only a few lights still on. Her day felt long but steady, like a river that never stopped moving. She reached her car and sat inside for a moment before starting the engine. She took a slow breath and let the quiet settle around her. Grace did not feel proud about what happened that morning. She felt tired of how predictable it was. She also felt aware that moments like that could become lessons if someone chose to learn. She started the car and drove out into the evening traffic. The city looked different at night, with softer sounds and slower faces. At a red light, Grace noticed a small food truck open on the corner. A line of workers stood close together to stay warm. She watched them for a moment and then looked forward again. Her mind moved from case details to simple life scenes. She found comfort in ordinary things. When Grace arrived home, she parked near her building and locked her car. Her apartment was modest and neat, with warm light in the windows. She walked upstairs and entered quietly. She placed her bag by the door and took off her coat. Then she stood still and listened to the silence. Grace made tea and sat at her small table. She did not turn on the television. She opened a folder from her bag and checked a few notes. Some judges carried the day like a shield, while others carried it like a weight. Grace carried it like a duty. Her phone buzzed with a message from Anna. Anna wrote that tomorrow's schedule had shifted and one hearing was moved earlier. Grace replied with a short acknowledgement and a thank you. She appreciated Anna more than she could say in a message. Good support made hard work possible. After a while, Grace closed the folder and leaned back. She thought again about the officers. She wondered what story they told themselves about what happened. She wondered if either one would speak differently the next time. Grace knew change was slow but still possible. Across town, the tall officer sat at a kitchen table in a small apartment. His name was Mark, and he looked worn out in a way he did not like to admit. He kept thinking about the words he had used without thinking. He felt embarrassed but also unsettled in a deeper way. Embarrassment faded but awareness stayed. Mark's partner, the shorter officer, sat on a couch and stared at the floor. His name was Dave, and he kept hearing the security guards greeting in his head. He realized he had judged a stranger with confidence and no evidence. He realized how quickly he had used authority like a shortcut. The thought made his stomach turn. Mark finally spoke and admitted he needed to do better. Dave nodded and said the same thing quietly. They did not talk about excuses. They did not talk about bad luck or misunderstanding. They talked about how easily they had dismissed someone. The next morning the sky was clear and cold. Grace arrived early again because she always did. She parked and walked toward the courthouse with steady steps. Her coat was the same and her bag was the same. Her posture was calm and grounded. Outside the entrance the security guard greeted her warmly. Grace nodded and thanked him. As she approached the steps she noticed a patrol car parked nearby. Mark and Dave were standing beside it. They looked alert and uncertain at the same time. Mark saw Grace and stepped forward carefully. He kept his hands visible and his voice low. He told her he wanted to apologize for how he spoke the day before. Dave nodded beside him and said he was sorry too. The words sounded plain but sincere. Grace stopped and looked at them without harshness. She listened and let the silence do some of the work. She could see the discomfort in their faces. She could also see they were not performing for an audience. That mattered. Grace thanked them for saying it directly. She told them respect should come before titles, not after them. Her voice remained calm and simple. Mark nodded as if the sentence landed exactly where it needed to land. Dave looked down for a moment and then met her eyes again. Grace did not lecture them further. She did not try to shame them. She knew shame could make people defensive instead of better. She simply said she hoped they would remember the moment. Then she continued toward the doors. Mark and Dave watched her walk away. They did not feel forgiven like a problem was solved. They felt corrected in a way that could guide their choices. They returned to their work with quieter minds. The street felt normal, but their thoughts did not. Inside the courthouse, Grace moved through security and into the elevator. The doors closed and she let out a slow breath. She did not feel satisfied. She felt steady. Sometimes steady was the best outcome available. Grace entered her chambers and reviewed the day's first file. A new set of names and facts waited for her attention. She prepared for another round of voices and decisions. The work did not pause for personal moments. Duty rarely did. Later that day, Grace presided over a hearing involving workplace discrimination. The testimony was careful and emotional. Grace listened with full attention and kept the room respectful. She made sure each person had space to speak clearly. She was firm when anyone tried to interrupt. When the hearing ended, Grace looked around the room before leaving. She saw fear in some faces and hope in others. She knew the law could be a shield when used with integrity. She also knew it could fail people when used without care. That knowledge guided her more than any praise ever could. As the afternoon moved on, Grace walked down the corridor toward another courtroom. A young clerk stepped aside to let her pass. A nervous witness took a deep breath and steadied their hands. Small moments happened around her all the time. Grace noticed them even when she said nothing. At the end of the day, Grace returned to her office and removed her robe. She sat at her desk and wrote a few notes to herself. She placed them in a folder for tomorrow. Then she looked out the window at the city again. The streets below carried people with problems and dreams and deadlines. Grace thought about the young version of herself who once felt invisible. She thought about the long hours and the sacrifices. She thought about how many times she had to prove she belonged. She did not romanticize the struggle. She simply accepted that it shaped her. Grace stood up and turned off the lamp. She gathered her bag and walked toward the door. Her footsteps echoed softly in the empty hallway. She walked out of the courthouse with the same quiet focus she brought in. The world outside was still imperfect, but she was still working.